Hello, everyone who is listening to us today. My name is Alina, and for the past 5 years, I am directing the Third Party and Supply Chain Cybersecurity Summit. Today, I am happy to introduce you to two exceptional professionals in the field of supply chain security. Michael Herburger, who is a research project manager at the University of Applied Sciences Upper Austria Logistikum Steyr, which is the largest research department for logistics and supply chain management in Austria. And Ray Stanton, currently executive partner at IBM. He has worked in communications, information technology, and security for more than 30 years. Recently, Michael and Ray have conducted a research on how supply chain cyber risks have evolved over the past 3 decades. And we're really thrilled to learn more on its outcome. Michael, Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alina, for your kind introduction. My name is Michael Herburger, and I'm research project manager at the University of Applied Sciences, Upper Austria. I'm head of research field, supply chain risk management, resilience, and security. Hello, Ray. It's a pleasure to meet you again and to talk again about our common research. We have spent a lot of time last months to support my research and to discuss a lot about your experience. Could you just give me a short overview about what we have discussed and what are the main aspects from your side that you have covered?
Michael, thank you. And yes, very pleased to see you again. And so I'm Ray Stanton, and I've been a CISO and CISO in a number of organizations over the last 25 years, ranging from Airbus through to recently a telecommunications company in Denmark called TDC. And we've looked at, and I know in your research, around all the different areas of maturity and how the areas have actually evolved in the area of supply chain security. And what does that actually mean around supply chain security? What did it mean to us as organizations? And what does it mean to people who are watching this video? And hopefully we can share some insights. And some of the summary things from me around this, it was interesting to look at it in the context of what does supply chain security mean? What does it mean to our business? Who affects it? Whether that is internal, whether that is external, whether it is global, whether it is geopolitical, but also when is 80% good enough versus 100%? And I think that's something that we as security and risk professionals struggle with, because we always aim for 100%, but it's not always needed. Also, understanding about how we continuously evolve, and how do you do that, and what does that mean in continuous evolution, and what does that mean for us in what we have to do when we're working with our partners in the supply chain. And note I say partners, I don't say vendors. And that's very critical, because it's about treating each other with respect and in the right way, and then you come to common goals. But some of the things I saw, and I know we're going to delve deeper, here's my overriding thing, is that when I started doing this back in the late 90s, we thought we were fantastic. We knew that we were breaking new ground, but it was still very fledgling in supply chain security. I worked initially in an organization which was hugely mature in manufacturing supply chain management. So Airbus, for example, very long established relationships, over many, many years. In the aircraft industries, those go back well over 100 years for the relationships and the partnerships. So they've learned how to evolve in quality, how to control, how to ensure they meet the regulatory requirements of all the aviation standards bodies, for example, safety. Security in the supply chain is very immature. And even in the 90s, in the late 90s, when we first started doing this, and I know we'll talk more, we thought we were breaking new grounds, and we were. But looking back, we were still very amateur. And that continued. And it was a fantastic time, and it still is a fantastic time. It's a fantastic area to be involved in. So for me, I look forward to talking through some of the key things that we found through your research and the discussions, and how this might help others learn and evolve.
Ray, you already, as mentioned, started addressing cyber risks or information risks, as they were called then, in supply chain back in the 90s of the last century. Today, most firms have never addressed cyber threats or risks in their supply chains, only focusing on their own firm. That's why the European Union will introduce the NIS2 directive this year, which expands cybersecurity activities significantly to the supply chain. So having your experience of over 30 years, what would you recommend to those firms who want to start addressing cyber risks in their supply chains?
So this is where I go back to how working together and understanding what you mean by supply chain security and what those directives mean and how that will affect you. But the approach of understanding that you need to move from compliance to assurance. So it's not just saying we've done it, which is the compliance and filling in a form and passing that back, or having an audit and coming around and showing, things. It's about proving it's been implemented, and that's the assurance. And it's about not just saying we've put these technical controls in place. Well, then you have to prove that you've put them in place, the assurance that it's in place. But the thing is about right sizing as well, right sizing for your supply chain and how you work with that supply chain. Because understanding a large organization, if you're a large organization and your supply chain is a large organization, they have huge teams that do this. They have huge teams that are now put in place to try and ensure that the controls are in place and that the assurance is there. But small organizations don't. So you have to, and this is my first guidance from experience, is make sure that you're not trying to force the same control sets in the same ways from the larger organizations to the smaller organizations. It doesn't mean the risk is any less to you as an organization, but it means you understand how to manage these smaller organizations. And you manage this by what we call compensating controls. So first of all, make sure you right size. Next is compensating controls. So and what do I mean by that? It means about what are you asking the organization and your own organization to attest to? So is it that you ask the small organization to do self-certification, for example? Do you send them a spreadsheet and a checklist? And then you say, okay, what are they providing for us? What connectivity do we have with them? What data do they store of ours? What information is potentially dangerous? Is it intellectual property rights? Is it they are a processor of our data, for example, when we're the controller of our data? Is it any of these things? And then is it, well, okay, now do they just need to fill out a self-certification audit for us, or do we need to then go and test them more? Do we want to do testing, for example, with a third party that might exist to test that smaller company? Or is it that we want to send one of our teams out? So these are all about compensating controls, and the same compensating controls that you have within your own organization, and understanding the impact on those. And when you talk about doing this with larger organizations, obviously the challenges are greater, because two large organizations coming together to audit each other is a much different challenge, and the risks are also different in the way that you come together. So use the understanding of compliance to assurance. You're telling us this, great, now prove it. And how do you demonstrate that? So those would be some of the key things I would say. But also understand about what tooling is available to you that wasn't available to us earlier in, you know, the 90s and the 2000s. So there are some great third-party tools, and there are now companies who carry out third-party audits on your behalf. So think about that as well. But again, I would suggest it's about right sizing. And this comes back to my point of when also is 80% good enough versus 100%. What is it that small company is doing, or the large company, and what's the risk associated? So that's something I would certainly understand. Yeah, I think those are the main principles that I would think about and suggest.
There are great suggestions and recommendations for those who want to start managing the cyber risks in the supply chain. Do you have additionally any recommendation on what companies should avoid at all costs? Any mistakes you have experienced that they should consider?
Many mistakes. So we, you know, through experience, we have spent time, and I've personally spent time, that organizations have self-attested. So we've sent them documents because we felt that we didn't have time, and that is compliance, where they're responding, and there's that great saying, if some of the our industry colleagues here have heard of it, which is trust but verify. So a mistake to avoid: do not think that just because they've returned the self-certification and what is called attestation. So they send you the document back, you send them a questionnaire, and you say, well, it's only, we've got thousands of people in our supply chain. I know this, you know this, we all know this. It's understanding who they are and how important and what the risk is. And it means undertaking the work to understand what they do. The first mistake that we made was not understanding what and who was the critical suppliers. So this is a piece of work that we should all undertake. It takes time to understand that, and it's heavy. But here's the thing, it saves you a lot of time when it comes to saying, even if you've got, and I've been 3,000 plus suppliers like many of you, if not more, 10,000 suppliers. But what it does is reduce that list down to only the few that you need to then ensure that you really focus on, because the rest are within your risk management profile. You say, that's okay, that's acceptable levels of risk, because we know that little organization over there, this is the only thing that they're doing. And this is the type of information, or this is how they're connected to us. And I know that even though they have a connection to us, let's just say a network connection, and they're sharing data, well, we know that we have our own technology controls in place. So that's part of our compensating controls. So the message there is, first of all, don't make the mistake of not understanding the critical list of suppliers. Don't think that that is just too much work. That will take us 2 years to understand that. Great. If it takes you 2 years, start now. Because in 2 years' time, you'll be saying, it'll take us 2 years. It won't really. It's actually really quick. But understand who they are. Then you can focus laser-like on the key and critical suppliers. So the mistake that I and teams have made, and personally we have moved on from, is not understanding the critical supply chain. And that is dependent on your organization. I've been in an organization where it's been about data, it's been about volume, it's been about how much business that we do with them. I've been in an organization where it's been partners where there's concentration of risk. So different parts of the organization have different, one contract in itself does not make that organization a critical supplier, but through experience, once we looked at all of the contracts on that critical supplier, we found it was concentrated risk. And that's something, is another mistake that we don't do. We don't look at all of the contracts that we have placed on organizations. We look at them in individual circumstance normally. So that would be also my suggestion there. Don't make the mistake of saying company B, they've got these one contract, two contracts. Make sure there's not 10 contracts. And that's something personally that I've seen as well. So that's certainly a mistake, but learning from that is critical.
I then suggest that we delve deeper in our common study. The core of our joint study was the focus on 5 managing approaches: managing through, up, in, out, and beyond. Those were the 5 managing approaches we have elaborated together. And we show how all 5 processes have changed over the last 30 years. In summary, the whole system has changed. Almost nothing is the same as it was 30 years ago. And the exciting thing is that most companies today still have not the maturity level that you already had back in the 90s of the last century, 30 years ago. So let's elaborate on the 5 managing approaches a little bit more in detail. Let's come to the first managing approach. It's managing through, and I want to explain it also to the listeners. Managing through refers to a scientific management approach that focuses on experiment and testing to learn about the supply chain and their cyber risks. Could you please tell us how you think that this approach has changed over the last 30 years, Ray?
Yeah, this was really interesting, especially as a concept. Once we were doing and going through the research, I found this very interesting personally, and it helped me reflect a lot. So if anything, I would suggest to the listeners and the viewers of this video, our colleagues, to think about this as well and how we've evolved. Managing through. And this is about making sure you understand how you evolve. And for example, I mentioned earlier on about working in the aircraft industry. And in there, we had a very mature approach to manufacturing and working with our partners. Now, in security, supply chain security, you would have a contract, you would place a contract with someone, even in the defense industry, as much as, you know, the private industry or the public sector. You know, there was very few that really stipulated specific things on the supply chain, unless you were really in defense and defense contracts where it was very different. Then most of us were dealing with general stuff. And what I mean by that, it starts with, again, we didn't really understand who our critical suppliers were. And for us, we were asked to undertake these audits by our business. First of all, it was the audit team that were being asked to do this, and our business was asking us to do these audits. They were dealing with audits from a, as I said, quality perspective. We were then asked to undertake these audits, and I use the word audits. It was very basic. It was using something for us, even with our international partners. We use something called British Standard 7799, and I'm sure a number of you on this, you know, conference will recognize that. You know, it evolved to also form part of ISO 17799 and then 27001. You know, so it was very, very core to what we did. But it was a paper-based audit. You would go out, there's checklist, randomly you would test things. And we realized very quickly that we needed to do more than just a paper-based audit. We would talk to people. We would go out and do physical visits to key suppliers. Now, our key suppliers at the time was based on not the criticality of the data, but it was based on the scale of the contract that we had actually placed. And the business had asked us then to go and do these audits. And we decided that we would make sure that through this process, we would demonstrate to the business that we would add value. We would not come back and just be that typical security person and team of everything is no, you can't do it like that. So that was critical, right? So we used something to be able to ensure that we had a standard against, and a consistent standard for all of the partners, which was BS 7799. We put it into a checklist. You know, it's fantastic when you look at it, because like the ISO standards, there's many, I think there's about 1,100 control objectives when you get into it, and people don't realize that. But also we would do these physical audits. We'd walk around their sites, we'd look at their buildings. And, you know, one of the funniest audits I think we talked about was we pulled up to one of our key suppliers' sites, and I said to the driver of this car, I said, can you just stop? And I said, tell me what's wrong with this picture. And in front of us was our key supply site, key manufacturing site. And right next to it was a propane bottling site. So these gas bottles, the ones that, you know, you fill with gas, and you see the ones, you think you've probably all seen them, orange or red or green bottles, you know, and they can be small, they can be, you know, some of them are nearly, you know, I think about 5 feet tall or 1.4 meters. They're huge. And this site was next to our key supplier. So we then started asking about, so what are your disaster recovery plans? What is your, you know, what we would call today business resilience? Oh, we don't really have any. Okay, maybe we need to think about, you know, let's help you. And that's a key thing I would suggest to the viewers, is what we didn't do is just say, oh no, this is no good, go back and write a report and say it was terrible. We said, right, this is what it is, but how can we help you? What experience have we got that we can help with? So that was the evolved learning for us, because we found when we went away and just wrote, oh, we'll come back and we'll see that you fixed it. That was no good. That wasn't a partnership. That was also not helpful to our suppliers, because you write a report and it comes an audit report and it's not helpful. You want to be able to help. So that was one of the key things that we learned through this. As I said, we also felt a little bit amateur, but we also, at the same time, we started to doing basic network checks, and we were doing basic testing on the environments. We'd get their agreement, we'd do that. We also wrote certain things into, for example, our contracts with them about what that would mean, you know, and about disaster recovery, you know. And at this time, you know, cyber insurance as we know it today wasn't around. That started to introduce itself. So in the 90s it didn't, but it did introduce itself in the early 2000s, and I've personal experience of seeing it around 2002-3. That evolution was critical. You know, we as an organization, as we evolved through the 90s, managing our supply chain and our partners through evolution, we learned. And this is what I would suggest to the viewers. It's about learning and not stopping. It's evolving. So, for example, when I talked about the audit reporting that we would use, we went just from using one type of report to a number of types of reports as they became more available, as the industry evolved in the 2010s and the 2020s, right? Sorry, through the 2000s and through to 2010s. As more organizations came on, we took advantage of those that were becoming available. We created and used, for example, pest reports. So this is reports that would look at the political, the economical, the social and technological impacts on us as an organization. And then we would say, how does that affect our supply chain? Today, if you look at what's going on right now with the Ukraine and Russia, many organizations are doing exactly that, looking at that geopolitical stance. How does that affect us? And how does it affect our supply chain? And that, again, is critical. It's about evolving. And then how do you help them? How do you build in business resilience? How do you build in all of those items to help you as an organization and help your supply chain survive? We've seen what happens, multiple different examples of supply chain failure. And this is about us trying to ensure that we help them have the right ability to survive, as much as you knowing what their criticality is to you. I think those are some of the key things. And like I say, the evolution continues. You know, evolution, for example, with now from that fledgling supply chain, cyber insurance from AIG back in 2002-3, when I saw that as a partner. Things like where we see bug bounty, you know, working with bug bounty programs. All of these can help, and this is how we evolve. So you manage it through continuous evolvement, continuous learning. But the biggest change that I see is moving from compliance to assurance. It's not just, here's the list, we've done it. It's, okay, you've done it, you've said you've done it, now let's test and prove it's there. That's the assurance. It's all too easy just to tick the box and say, yes, they've done it. Again, that does come back to understanding the criticality of that supplier.
Great overview about what we have discussed during the managing through approach. That was the first approach we have elaborated last 30 years. The second approach is managing up. And this considers the larger political context that influence you as a manager and of course, vice versa meanwhile. Could you please also inform us your observation on how this approach has changed over the last 3 decades?
Yes, so this is interesting because managing it, when you think about those political impacts and the effect on your organizations and regulatory standards and the groups that existed, there definitely wasn't any security standards and regulatory needs for this back in the 90s. You know, they just didn't exist, right? You had contractual needs, you had defense in different countries. Your whether you're working in the US, you know, federal requirements, those are different, right? But as general standards, supply chain security, and even those, they weren't really about supply chain. They were, we've got a contract in place. You need to, you know, keep our information secure. You need to prove these things. You need to, you know, use these standards. But the political influence changed, and particularly we saw this change during, you know, late 2000, 2010, and then particularly in the 2020s, you know, we all saw the impact. We saw the impact on partners, you know, across the globe when people like the US made some stance about the partners and the suppliers that it would allow to operate within its borders. But the challenge was about how we managed up and outwards. You know, and it became influence and lobbying, right? And using the community. So what do I mean by that? You know, if you look at GDPR, you know, and the impact that GDPR has had on us all with our supply chain, you know, that started life back in the late 2000s. And then it went through a series of lobbying, and it went through a series of issues. You know, it came out as a directive before it came out regulation. But myself and many others, we were already lobbying and trying to influence the impact of that, you know, with the European Commission. And this is what I would say to you all. You can have the ability to influence and lobby through specific groups. And we did that, and I did that through working with the World Economic Forum, for example, and with something called the Information Security Forum. The Information Security Forum is an industry body, but all of you have these industry bodies. So we saw this evolution, and we know that the impact had great challenges on us. You know, I saw it personally from, you know, the impacts of when contracts at national level were being placed, and what did that mean for us as a supplier, and what did we have to do? So, you know, and having engineers come on our sites from different countries that maybe we wouldn't have necessarily had before. You know, and those are things that are well outside any of our pay grade and well above all of our levels, but we have to deal with them, you know, and then that comes back to the managing through. How do you manage through all of the things that I talked about separately? How do you deal with that? So managing up is changed significantly from the 90s through the 2000s through 2010, 20. And today we see it now. We see the impact. You know, there was huge challenges, you know, 2018, 19, 20, you know, around supply chain, around China, you know, around Russia, around BRIC countries. And we have to deal with that. So my recommendation is work with, there are now many more groups that focus on supply chain security, you know, and industry bodies and communities like conferences where you can share information. But also, as I said, there are groups that can manage up and outwards by influencing and lobbying. And don't be fooled. We all have the opportunity to influence and lobby, right? And whatever level we are, if we have a good voice and a good opinion and a good point, you can all lobby. So the final thing I would say there has, the landscape has changed immensely from when we first started this, and the impact on us and the people that we have to manage up and outwards, like the regulators or like the different government bodies for security. When it's private companies, you used to say, we're not having to worry about that, and now we do.
Great. Let's continue then with the third managing approach. While external parties in the larger political context are the core of managing up, the following approach, managing in, refers to the internal influence within the company and within the supply chain, because you also have definitely different impacts also internally within the firm and within the supply chain. How this approach changed since the 90s?
And this is one of the most challenging, right? You know, as security and risk professionals, we have this challenge of, and I know many of you will smile, you know, managing our colleagues, managing our peers, working with our peers, working with our business units, you know, for those organizations, whether you're small or large, whether you are national or international, you know, whether you are geocentric, so you are managed by your country, or whether you're managed globally, you know, this can be good, painful, it can be challenging, but it is interesting. So all of this, if nothing else, I would say is fantastic, fun and interesting. And this, first of all, for me, comes from in the early 90s, was where I remember my first conversation with my CEO when I'd just been appointed, and we were having a conversation about what a guy called Ray Wilson, this Scottish guy, and he looked at me and said, "So what are you going to do in the first sort of year? What is it you're going to do?" And I said, "Well, look, you know, I've only been doing this, you know, a few weeks now. You know, here's the objectives that I'm going to set out and what we think we're going to do." And this when I was at Airbus. And he just said, "Oh, I don't know what the value of security to me is." And I was like, "Well, okay, well, the defense company might say something, but it was important because I was understanding." And I said to him, "We will prove value to you. We'll prove business value to you. And we will do that within 12 months. And that was a big stance. And it was about security in totality, not just about this. But that's the first thing that I would say. The managing in is about how you demonstrate and prove value to your business colleagues, that we are not just a cost. We are not just a cost to the bottom line. That is so important. if you can demonstrate value to them by helping them improve their business, by helping them secure the business. And that is why when then I look at this supply chain, immediately what we were looking at, as I said, was business continuity, business resilience. So take an example. One of our partners, our big engineering partners, they used to supply to us, this is in Airbus, they would supply what are called the spars for an aircraft. So these long pieces of metal that go inside a big wing. And these things go through and they go into these big acid baths and they get chemically etched. So all of this is done by high automation. You can imagine it's timed to the second. But even then, we had them connected to networks. We had, you know, old PCs on them, right? You know, I think back then it might have been DOS2 machines, right? You know, so, but that evolved into, you know, basic Windows machines, you know, in the early 2000s. They were connected to the networks. And I remember when we were undertaking one particular review, and this was within that 12 months, we'd been asked to go out by our business who held the budget, and I'll come back to that. We came back and we said, we asked them at the time, we said, what happens if that fails? What happens if you get a basic virus? What happens if, you know, they said, well, the thing just stops, right? Well, what does that mean? Because this was what today, think about IoT, this was a PC controller unit, right? And what you would call today, it's IT, OT, right? And IT connected to OT, and it's a controller unit. And we were like, wow. And bear in mind, I'm not in an engineering field like these guys. Well, so what do you do and how long does it take? Well, production and this can be down for 24 hours. How often has that happened? Well, you know, about a dozen times this past year. Oh, okay. You know, has that impacted supply chain? You know, supply? Oh, yeah. So we didn't just say, oh, that's terrible. What we did was we came away and we thought about it, and then we came back to them and we gave a report to our business. We said, look, this is what we found, but here's our suggestions. Here's how they can improve it. Here's how they can protect themselves. And here's the truth. We know that supplier by putting in, so we did that as the first recommendation. Then we went back, one of the team went back, checked to see what they'd done, gave them some more advice. It was our investment in our supplier and said, how have you done that? Okay, right, you know, let's see. Well, maybe you should do this. And they adjusted. But within the year, the following year, rolling year, we knew that the outages and the impacts of that impact was down to 2, right? And that was just because of the system actually had fallen over. And it wasn't because there was, back then, we also trying to find out if it was anything nefarious that somebody was messing about on the networks was really difficult. You know, for those of you that know forensics, trying to do that and find it on their environment, on a shop floor, manufacturing floor, there was no chance in that environment we were going to find out. But we could see that. So that was about demonstrating value, and by taking those proof points to see, not just you've done the audit, but then see what the impact is and follow it through and see the benefit of that business continuity. That was why it was so important, because the business could see we did this, we helped them, we monitored it, and this is what the benefits were. And that was really important. So that was about demonstrating value, improving value, because then the investment of the effort, and I want to come to that then, because when we started, the budgets to do this was held by our engineering groups and different business units. Over time, so they requested us to do this work. So first of all, it was a tick box, because security, we were raising awareness, and they were going, oh, maybe we should get this checked. And we'd had a few incidents. And they said, well, you know, so we'll pay for it. And over time, that changed, because then as our budgets changed, we were being asked to hold a budget to carry out, you know, these supply checks. And it's a very good supply program that they still do today. And I saw that evolve through the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, that not all organizations released their budgets. But what I mean by that is that the budgets were starting to be held by the security and risk departments, so that we then held our own budget to be able to undertake these. But critically, throughout that time, and the managing in was, we agreed who the key suppliers were and who we would undertake these reviews with, and the supply chain audits and support. And that was important, because if you just do this because you say, as the security department and the risk department, they need to be done, you're not engaged in your business. So this would be one of my recommendations. Work with the business, do the qualification of who the critical suppliers are with the business, because most of the time it's them that's placing, and I say the business could be your lines of business, whatever you call it within your organization. It doesn't matter what you call them, but whoever is placing these contracts, you should be working with them. Agree who are the key ones, and then involve them in discussion. Demonstrate the value to them, because you want them on your side as supporters. And that's why I say it's not about doing the audit and the reviews at one time. It's about following it through and proving support and demonstrating that value. I think that's a couple of key things. There was something else that was also important. As new regulations come through, and you'll see this, as you said, within this D2, right? And the new regulations come through. We saw this particularly with GDPR, because it can become very confusing for your partners in your supply chain. So, for example, when we introduced GDPR controls and attestations and certifications, as many of you will now know that you have to do as part of your contracts, when we were all rushing to put this in place, we had many different units asking our suppliers for formal certification of security, and they had to carry out reviews. So you need to use that as a way, and any regulation, when you start to do this, it's a good way to take stock who are your critical suppliers, but do it collectively as one unit, not 2, 3, 4 different, not legal, not the privacy team, not security, not the business. Do it once. And if it's not security and risk, that's fine. Be part of the group that says, okay, legal, you're going to do that because it's fallen under this new regulation around privacy. You'll do that. Here's our input, rather than everybody asks the same questions. Because not only does it confuse your partners, it takes their time, their effort, their cost, your cost, when you could be better focused if you know somebody else is doing it. But also, it makes sure you get the answer once, and the right answer, because then the partner is focused in the right place. So all of that means that the managing in over the years, the value, the infighting changed, right? We were being asked to do things, and then you have better conversations. And I've seen a better evolution as I've evolved doing this over the years in my roles, you know, that we are better engaged by our business lines if we are acting like business people and we demonstrate business value. We're not just doing this because it says we need to do it on the supply chain. It's because we're demonstrating value of proving that we are helping maintain business resilience of our company and our supply chain.
Great last aspect there, definitely. From the third approach, let's now continue with the fourth approach. It's managing out. And this approach refers to the involvement of external parties and stakeholders in the managing process and decision-making in supply chains. How do you think has this approach changed over the last 3 decades?
Yeah, and this really does come down to, again, understanding the breadth of your focus, right? And who is it in that managing out? Who do you need to work with? And certainly we saw the evolution has changed massively, right? You know, back in the 90s, these groups just really didn't exist. The the understanding of what the impacts are. I talked earlier on about what we would know now as IT/OT. Well, you know, that evolution has changed as well, and I'll give a good example of that in a moment. But understanding who those types of organizations that you should be managing out to are. So, for example, one of our, we built a red and black team, so for doing penetration testing in my last role. And we wouldn't have thought of doing this in the 90s at this level. But in the late 20s, you know, one of the suppliers to us, and think about this as an organization, you know, we were asked by a business to test our pension fund, right? Our pension fund suppliers, because they had this critical web portal where everybody could get access to their details around their pension fund, right? And financial data. And you think about it, guys, how many of you ensure that you've tested? So we had our red team do some testing, you know, and also we found some things out, you know, not only on the on their website, but also on the app that they've developed. But also we did some auditing and some reviews with them. And that's an example of managing out, understanding what the breadth is around your ecosystem. An ecosystem is that sort of thing. And I ask this question to you all: how many of you have tested your pension suppliers? If it was my pension fund, I'd want to. But also, as I say, the managing out, the critical thing here was how to engage others and the groups that we needed to engage. Michael, you know that the breadth of this is huge. And how you influence before it enters your environment. So a great example is a company that, you know, and we would call this IoT, right? You know, we had a coffee machine that the teams were in, you know, one of these free coffee machines, and I'm sure many of you have them in your organization, and some of you don't, I'm sure. But on there, the teams were saying, hey, great, we've connected it to the network, and guess what? We can load up videos and we can put, you know, company videos on there. We can do all of these things, and it's brilliant because people can see them while they're getting a coffee, and we can reinforce messaging, and we were like, great. You know, have you thought what that means? Because many of us used to just think about connections of printers, for example. And I'm sure some of you have thought about this and going, yeah, Ray, we've seen that, we've dealt with that. But it's just thinking about that breadth and thinking about what your ecosystem is. So not just within your company and the company boundaries, but how it affects. So the managing out is about how you engage them as well, how you influence them. That's part of what I consider, you know, that. And as I said, the managing out was also how you look at things like the external support, where you need to help organizations. You get help from external organizations. So, you know, bug bounties I mentioned earlier on, right? That evolution of bug bounties, this wasn't around in the 2090s, wasn't around in the, 1990s, in the 2000s and the 2010s. You know, we only saw it really evolve through probably mid 2010s, maybe 14, 15. It was very fledgling. People said, well, what's that? But we used it. And also crowdsourcing. If you can't afford the big pen testing organizations, or the big four type organizations, or the large organizations, crowdsourcing is a great way. And there's some great crowdsourcing pen testing organizations, right? Fantastic. That's about managing out. That's about using those facilities that are available to you, which you may not necessarily always think of. But think about that ecosystem as well. That's a critical one. And that would be my recommendation there. I hope that helps there.
Great. Thank you very much for elaborating on the fourth approach. Let's come now to the last and fifth process of managing, it's managing beyond. And this approach refers to a more radical approach that challenge the processes, structures, and decisions beyond or outside the supply chain. Again, my question, how do you see how this managing approach have changed over the last 30 years?
Yeah, again, and it's a great point, because the last point I talked on also falls into this, I believe, which is, you know, the bug bounty side. But I think this is where we as organizations need to think about the models. You know, right now there's a high drive on zero trust modeling, right? And what does that mean? A number of years ago, we didn't really think of it in that way. I can remember in the 1990s when I first started in security, and we were looking at our supply chain. First thing we said was, right, you know, how many EDI links? And for some of you, you won't even know what an EDI link is, right? And this was us having a physical connection to a third party. And it was like, well, okay, a dedicated link to a third party, because that was the way it was back then. That's how you did this. That's how you ensured, you know, because the internet back in the late 90s just wasn't stable enough for companies to trust. You know, you didn't have SD-WANs, you didn't have all those interconnects. And we had, excuse me, we had 1,600 links. 1,600 dedicated links. And, you know, these ranged back then, which was huge, you know, from 32 kbit line up to a 2 meg line. And 2 meg back then, I promise you, was fantastic, you know, and that was supplying to the whole company. However, you know, 1,600 links. And that was why we quickly said in my earlier statement, understanding the critical suppliers was key, right? And I remember having this conversation with my head of audit, and he said, well, why are you focusing on them? And I said, why do I care about all of those when I've got this concentration of risk here? Let me deal with that first, then we can deal with those. And that's something to think about. And that is this point of managing beyond, is understanding that challenge, right? This zero trust modeling that we've moved towards, we didn't exist then. It started to come in the 2000s. You know, there was something called the Jericho Forum. This was all about borderless boundaries and breaking down barriers. You know, the principle of how you could work, you know, together, but understand, you know, Jericho Forum, pulling down the walls. And that was the principles in reality of zero trust. And zero trust today, you think about the modeling, you know, it comes down also to the models of need to protect, right? What do I need to protect? If this is my core, what do I need to protect around it to keep the core running, my core business? And that's really important. That's hard work. But also working with other industry consortiums, right? And learning from them and sharing with them what that modeling is. And that's how Managing Beyond works. But the thing about industry consortiums, and there's a number of these that I've been involved in over the years, from the aircraft manufacturers through to dealing with the utilities and the power companies. There's a lot of this takes place behind closed doors because they cannot always share some of the things that they're doing. So you have to navigate that as well. But I would suggest to the viewers, if you can, get engaged in, if there exists, your industry forum. And if it doesn't, well, maybe you've got the opportunity to necessarily create an industry forum, bring like-minded groups together to see how you can share information. You don't have to share it to the world, but share information which helps us all improve. We need to improve. That's the way that you need to think about it. You know, and there is this there's this English word called dichotomy. It's a difficult position to be put in place, because sometimes in those industry groups you will find information which can actually benefit the greater good, but depending on your role in national security or in your I mean things like power and utilities companies, I mean things like key supply chains, critical supply chains, could just be supplying call handling to, not just, but call handling to ambulance, for example. If you're part of an industry group that finds out something, and I've seen this where we found out something and we knew because we tested it on certain specific environment, that actually this very well publicized threat that this group is hacking group, and a well-known hacking one, was saying this is what we've done and this is what happens. We knew it actually wasn't executing because we tested it, and we knew that it wouldn't work. So now you have this problem and this challenge of, do we go out and publicly say, oh, it's not going to work, and then they move on to find out how can they make it work? Or do you leave it so that those critical supply chains, those critical industries can still monitor? And that's a real dichotomy, and those are decisions that are hard to make. And I've been in that position with organizations, and you then have to decide what to do. But being part of an industry forum and that managing beyond, that's how you do that. You work in those groups, you share information because you can share it to those key players and work with each other. So sharing information is critical. You know, that helps with that assurance model and bringing up the quality of what you're doing and the protection.
Let me ask one more question to the 5 managing approaches. If you compare the 5 approaches, which one is the most important today, and has the importance also changed over time? Is there a difference nowadays compared to the 90s of the last century?
That's a great question, but I'm going to reframe it slightly in I don't think any of them are. First of all, it's a 5 point model that the viewers should learn, because I think it's brilliant the way you've structured this. It's helped me revisit and learn and actually look at what I'm doing again and say, how are we dealing with these areas in my teams? But I wouldn't say there's one that's far more important than the other. I couldn't say, you know, they all peak at various times, but they're all important. You know, geopolitical, right now, what's going on? Well, it went quiet for a while. Now suddenly it's become hot because our organizations, are there threats to our supply chain? Are there threats to us geopolitically, you know, with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, for example? And it's not just within one country. You know, when you look at what happened, for example, with COVID, well, that affected us all. You know, and then you had to work across all those different areas, across all your 5 legs, right? And those pillars. But also, when you're dealing with managing in, understanding, well, every year we have to go through a budget cycle. Every year we have to go, you know. So I don't believe that there's one that's more important than the other. They all peak at certain times, but they all need attention. And that's why I think your analysis and research is fantastic, because it simplifies it for people. It makes it clear, what are you doing in these areas? Here's the thing that I would add to this. Thinking about, for me, the skills, this is the important one that I would say that brings it together for them. It is the skills and what helped support me personally going through this journey over, you know, now, you know, 20, 25 years, from when it was very, let's not say new, but, you know, very early in supply chain security as we know it today. The key things is about understanding your business. So adapt your business skills as much as your risks knowledge skills, as much as your technical skills. Adapt your business skills, adapt your ability to engage your business, understand what they do, understand what your line of business is doing that has a key contract with a specific supplier. Understand what their challenges are, engage with them, develop your interpersonal skills, the ability to go and sit with them and learn about them and their business. Understand that you're trying to do this together. And as I said to people, I have a huge ego, but know when to park it at the door, because security and risk is not the only player here. It's about the benefits towards your organization. Whether you are public sector or private, it doesn't matter. So check your ego at the door, learn what the business is about and work with them and get them to work with you. I promise you, I assure you, I look you all in the eyes that once you've demonstrated real clear value to them, they will come back to you time and time and time again, and they will support you. So develop those skills. Perseverance, right? That's something about you. Don't always say no. Say, how can we find a way around this? I have many good examples of we could have just said no, but by proving value to the business and saying, no, but we can't do it like that, but we'll find a way with you. That is critical, because as soon as you say no, you do two things. One, and you all know this, but I'll say anyway, they go off, they do it anyway, and then the next time they won't even come and ask you. So that's my words of wisdom. I hope this has been enjoyable. I hope I've given you some things to think about. So Michael, thank you very much. Thank you for, the opportunity to take part in the research. Thank you for the great question and for me to revisit many things, but also to learn about how it was structured and how I can continuously learn. Because above all, there was one overall strength that you've asked me about many times. It's that continuous learning. So thank you, because you've allowed me to do that again with this, and it was a great experience. So thank you.
Thank you also, Ray. It was also a great experience. I also enjoyed it very much because I learned a lot, and I hope also the listeners and watchers of the video can also learn by listening to our discussion. Thank you, Ray. Thank you again for your support.
Thank you, Michael.